Contradictions have been a common thing in the past days as the country seeks to know who was behind the recent looting and vandalism in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. Intelligence has come under heavy scrutiny, with many saying that state security could have been able to detect who was planning to incite violence in the two provinces. Experts say it would be of vital importance for government to consider sharing intelligence information within the security cluster in order to avoid conflicting messages by cabinet ministers to the public. Now, let's discuss this further. We joined via Zoom by Jakkie Cilliers, the head of African Futures and Innovation at the Institute for Security Studies. Mr. Cilliers, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Now, 276 people have died in what we now know was an attempted insurrection. If you look at the scale of the violence that took place in this country, one needs to ask, are these the signs of a failing security sector?
In my view, yes. President Ramaphosa has, since coming into power, placed a significant amount of attention on particularly economic reform, various investment conferences, the new agenda for economic growth and so on, but he has not paid attention to the security sector. And this is a sector that did receive a lot of attention under former President Jacob Zuma, who used the intelligence agencies very clearly as part of the factional battles. Significant amounts of money were diverted. And if you read the report, or the Mufamadi report on the State Security Agency, I mean, literally the State Security Agency is beyond repair. That's basically the conclusion. And then we have, so intelligence is a problem. The police are overstaffed and really there's very little coordination and poor management. And the Defence Force is pointing in the wrong direction. They need to be orientated towards the real challenges that face South Africa. The prosecuting authority, the judiciary and so on seem still to be relatively intact, but these other components really are in need of entire reconstitution and pointing them in the direction of the real challenges that face South Africa going forward. And these range from what's happening in Eswatini to Cabo Delgado, and of course, ongoing internal unrest and instability that, of course, at the moment is being driven by the factionalism within the ANC. But given the extent of unemployment and inequality, we can be sure that we will continue to face rioting and violence for many years to come.
I was, in fact, going to ask you, these factional battles that we are seeing within government and also seeing within the security cluster itself, are they causing and exposing us more to this security safety risk, as you say? But moving on now, we know that there was a 2018 State Security Agency report of the high-level panel that was chaired by Dr. Sidney Mufamadi in 2018, as I said. Now, he made a number of recommendations. How many of these recommendations were used, if any? And maybe unpack what you think, in your view, should have been adopted in 2018, and we probably wouldn't be speaking about this now.
Well, none of us know what's happening within the State Security Agency because everything is a secret. And this is part of the problem. We have an excessive secrecy, particularly within those departments. There is no oversight, budgetary or otherwise. Their reports are not believed. We even have a situation where the various departments, police and so on and so forth, dispute whether they did receive the report. But even if they did receive reports, I doubt very much if the other departments would in actual fact believe anything that comes from the State Security Agency. I mean, you have an agency that is caught trying to fly drones and all kinds of stuff in Mozambique. But it's really, we are, in simple terms, blind. We don't even have the basic capacity in South Africa to do very basic crime pattern analysis within the police. work that the Institute has done indicates that 75% of the places where violence occurred in the last week are locations where repeat violence has happened for many, many years. And the nature of that, of this kind of violence, is that it's relatively well predictable. Locations where police-community relations are bad, that have a history of violence, where people are particularly poverty-stricken and so on, that's very often where your violence happened. This happened again. So the intelligence community, we need really to shine a spotlight on what happens there, and that is primarily the function, of course, of Parliament, but also we need to look at what's happening in the police. It's very evident that the lack of coordination within the security cluster is really a source of concern. These ongoing fights about what have we seen, and is it a counter-revolution or whatever the case may be, it's really embarrassing. So a real need to focus on the intelligence agencies. They get largely enough money, except maybe for the Department of Defense, but without pointing the Department of Defense into our real challenges, which is border security, area protection, support to the police and peacekeeping. Giving the SANDF more money also doesn't make much sense. Yeah, so many, many challenges, but hopefully a time that we can focus on getting that right, because we are going to need our security forces going forward.
Now, I want us to zone in some of the points that you've just raised now, particularly in the kind of threat that we saw. I mean, in my introduction, I said there were contradictions initially in terms of what kind of a security threat the unrest did pose. We know that, as you've said, that ministers were in disagreement, and these are ministers within the security cluster, which is of concern. So my question to you is, talk to us about why government is settling on this being an attempted insurrection, as opposed to some of the threats that we heard could have likely caused this unrest. I mean, one of them was as far-fetched as it being a coup d'etat, as an example. And as you've said, other people have mentioned it as an uprising, from your poor people, etc., or those that are marginalized in the country. Talk to me about why attempted insurrection is something that we should be, pegging this at, and what exactly that means.
I'd be less concerned about what we call this. I think it is important that government decide on a line and stick to that, and it seems to be a violent insurrection. Clearly, there was organization that initiated this, and it clearly was an attempt to weaken and embarrass government, and perhaps to initialize something broader, some kind of Arab Spring kind of event. But it was driven by the factionalism within the ANC. Let's just say this was what government says, a violent insurrection. It was a deliberate attempt to do South Africa harm, and to do South Africa harm because of the internal battles within the ANC, because you have a constitutional court that has sentenced a former president to jail. And then we have efforts, as we heard a few minutes ago, to find some kind of a political solution to something which is of a criminal nature. We really need to have consequence management in South Africa. One of the reasons why we have we have many problems in South Africa: inequality, poverty, and bad relations, and racism, and xenophobia, and so on. But one of the reasons is because that we have this level of violence is because of inefficiency within the security cluster. People are not held accountable. They are not put in jail and stay and prosecuted, and so on and so forth. And accountability starts at the top. If the ANC demonstrates from the top leadership that it holds people to account, and President Ramaphosa is trying to do that, then lots will change. But if ordinary people on the street, see that there is no consequences, you can do whatever you want to do in South Africa, you can steal, loot, then we have a problem. So getting the security agency sorted and efficient and accountable is very important. I say again, we will be facing recurring violence in South Africa, crowd and mass violence, given the extent of our challenges. So while we ramp up the economy and get the economy growing, because only a growing economy and only jobs in the formal sector will eventually reduce inequality. While that happens, and that's going to take a few years, we need to manage the situation. And managing the situation means we take our existing money that we spend on the security cluster, intelligence, police, defense, and so on, and home affairs, and do away, for example, with the border management, the idea of a border management agency, and focus this money on the actual tasks that we expect of these departments. Reduce VIP protection significantly, and so on and so forth. There's lots that can be done within the current framework of a state which has a very constrained budgetary allocation as well, constrained budget, as we know.
Mr. Cilliers, I hope that, the powers that be are listening, to some of those interventions that we could take. But let me squeeze in this last question. We are expecting that presidency briefing shortly, as you know, from by the acting minister in the presidency. But perhaps a final question from my side. I mean, when one looks at our borders and what's happening in our region, particularly in Mozambique and those countries, there is that, obviously, that niggling question behind most South Africans' minds. What would happen if this country were under attack for whatever reason, given the status quo in terms of our security clusters at the moment?
South Africa is a regional superpower. We need to make sure we have the defensive capability to defend ourselves, but we are not facing some kind of conventional military threat from any of our neighbors. In actual fact, we should be a source of stability. We should be looking after our borders because we have a huge xenophobic problem. We've got to try and manage poor illegal inward migration into South Africa. We should be encouraging skilled, high-quality inward migration into South Africa. We do completely the reverse because we've taken home affairs and made it part of the security cluster. Home affairs should in actual fact be part of the economic cluster. It is there to help build prosperity. So I think that the region is becoming more unstable, and we need the capability to help stabilize the region. But we also need to look at ourselves. And our first priority is to build security for ordinary citizens in South Africa, that the intelligence, the police, the judiciary provide a security blanket and provide that protection that you and I can feel in the country. So many challenges, but also opportunities ahead.
Fantastic. Jakkie Cilliers, Head of African Futures and Innovation at the Institute for Security Studies. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, sir.